Production and distribution of City Club Forums on IdeaStream is made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskind Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Good afternoon, and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. I'm Pat McDonald, Director of the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections. It is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker, Secretary of State for Ohio, Jon Husted. Throughout the last several presidential election cycles, you probably heard pundits and media commentators alike recite the phrase, "As Ohio goes, so goes the nation," articulating our history as a pivotal swing state. There are almost 8 million registered voters in Ohio, accounting for 18 electoral votes and making up 4% of the U.S. population. In 2008, voter turnout in Ohio surpassed national turnout by almost 7%. No Republicans have won the White House without carrying Ohio, and only 2 presidents have been elected without winning Ohio since 1900. Providing oversight to elections process is a job of our Secretary of State, Jon Husted. During his time in office, Ohio has implemented statewide absentee ballot mailings to voters in all 88 counties in 2012 and in 2014, and creating extended in-person voting hours. Ohio has received high marks for elections preparedness by voter advocacy groups, including Common Cause, the Verified Vote Foundation, and Rutgers Law School University. Mr. Husted was the first elected to public office in 2000, and as a member of the Ohio House of Representatives. 4 years later, he was elected Speaker of the House, making him one of the youngest ever to lead this body. He has also led the passage of the Educational Choice Scholarship, a school choice option for children trapped in failing schools, and the creation of Choose Ohio First Scholarship to encourage Ohio students studying in the STEM disciplines of science, technology, engineering, mathematics, and medicine. After serving 2 years as Speaker, Mr. Husted was elected to the Ohio Senate, where he was an advocate for redistricting reform. In 2010, he was elected as our 53rd Secretary of State. His leadership has been recognized nationally. In 2013, the Washington Post blog, The Fix, named him one of their top 10 rising stars in America. I have personally known Secretary of State Husted for many years, beginning with his days in the State House, and now working with him more closely as our top election official. He is an excellent public servant and an outstanding Secretary of State. I consider him a good friend. Ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club of Cleveland, please welcome our Secretary of State, Jon Husted.
Good afternoon, all. I want to start by acknowledging a couple of my longtime friends who are here with me today, Jim Mocho and Sean Keneally. They are like brothers to me. Raise your hands, guys. They were teammates of mine at the University of Dayton. They were on the national championship team. We all played on the defensive side of the ball together, and it's great to be with them. They are part of some of my greatest memories in life. So, thanks, guys, for being here. I should note that first of all, the students did a great job. That was fantastic. Yeah. And I probably should issue a trigger warning because I will be talking about the presidential election. And I know some people will find that offensive. But your point and your topic and the issue that we were exploring around about candid conversations about things in our world, sometimes there are uncomfortable conversations, Keep that in mind as I go through this, because in some ways that's what's happening in America right now. We're having some uncomfortable conversations, maybe not in the most civil way, but perhaps it's time that we explore them as a society. And literally what I was going to talk about today has changed. When I decided I was going to come do this event, I was going to talk about something completely different. And I plan someday to come back and talk about that. But for today, there's an entirely more dominant issue that's being discussed in America, and as our chief elections official of the state, I cannot ignore it. And that is, what in the world is happening to American democracy, and can we still believe in it? Because it's a conversation that we're talking a lot about these days. Yes, Republicans appear to be on the way to nominating Donald Trump to be their nominee, and while somewhat more overlooked, there's also a revolutionary event going on the other side of the political spectrum. A guy who was a socialist before becoming a Democrat has seriously challenged the political establishment for the Democratic presidential nomination. But it looks like it will be Trump versus Hillary. And like most of our pop culture, both of these folks don't need first and last names when we refer to them. It's just Trump and Hillary. And we know who they're talking about. According to the recent polling data, the majority of people in America already have a negative opinion of each candidate. And that is before the flame-throwing tactics of the general election even start. So it's only going to get worse, right? For whatever objections you may have about the superdelegates and the caucus system and independent voters voting in primaries, these two candidates, whom everybody seems to dislike, were chosen by the same American people who have a negative opinion of them. It begs the question of why. Why would the majority of Americans choose candidates that they seem to dislike? Political scientists, journalists, and pundits are trying to explain this, and I'm sure they will be trying to do so for years. And I certainly can't explain it all. But I do believe I can offer some insights as seen through the eyes of my own family and the town that I grew up in, Montpelier, Ohio. This is just not a political assessment. It's the story of economic and social change in America. So not long after Harry Truman finished his final term as president, my dad, Jim Husted, turned 16 and he dropped out of high school. He was the oldest boy of 8 children in a family that struggled financially, and they needed him to go to work to help make ends meet. And he did. He went to work installing gas pipelines in deep trenches across northwest Ohio. It was hard and dangerous work, and he did it 6 days a week. But he made a lot more money in 1 week than my grandparents did a month. So I want you to think about this just for a moment. He was making good money as a 16-year-old high school dropout and supporting a family. A 16-year-old high school dropout making good money supporting a family. But it was hard work, and after 2 years on the job, one day a trench collapsed and he barely escaped severe injury. He knew he could not do this the rest of his life, and he decided he wanted to go back to high school. So he stopped in to visit his principal and asked him if he could come back and finish. And the principal said, of course. He even welcomed him back by giving him study hall, his first period. And it was important that he had that, because my dad worked second shift in an aluminum factory until midnight. And then he went home and went to bed and got up every morning and went to school until he graduated. After graduation, he found work at a factory in the machine tooling industry. And eventually I came along when my parents adopted me and we settled in Montpelier, Ohio, a town of about 4,000 people in the furthest northwest corner of the state. The county I grew up in was Williams County. That's where I called home. That's where I spent my formative years. And in the 1970s, Montpelier was a place with farming families and small manufacturing companies that served the auto industry that flourished in nearby Toledo and Detroit. It was a place where factory jobs were available that you could raise a family on. Between manufacturing and agriculture, it supported other services and stores, and it was a typical Midwestern small town to grow up in. My dad worked at one of those machine tool companies, and it was called Mohawk Tools. The company made tools that machined parts for auto, truck, farm, and the construction industry. At its height, Mohawk Tools employed 400 people in a town of 4,000. So it was a pretty big deal in this small town. It was a family-owned business that would later be sold to a larger corporation. And in addition to my dad, I had 2 uncles that worked there and an aunt, along with many of the parents of my friends. Between manufacturing and agriculture, the people of Montpelier made enough to support the family-owned stores in town. And I knew them. They were owned by some of my classmates. Zilks sold televisions and appliances. Easlers sold men's clothing. Siebenallers sold shoes. The Rings family owned the drugstore. And there was a furniture store and restaurants and a lumber yard that were all locally owned. Those business owners supported the town through sponsorships of things like Little League Baseball. They served on the school board, and they stepped up to help every time somebody was in need, because this town was made up of their friends and their neighbors and their customers. But by the mid-1880s, or mid-1980s, this was all changing. It was the beginning of a more global, automated economy that we are in the midst of today. Mohawk Tools was in trouble and was on its way out of business due to a declining domestic auto industry and competition from foreign automakers. Other manufacturers in town were also feeling the pain of this changing economy and would follow suit soon after, leaving Montpelier, a small town with fewer and fewer good jobs and little opportunity to fill the void. Roughly 10% of the people who lived in my hometown worked at Mohawk Tools. Its closure was devastating. There weren't many other places to go to work. My aunt and uncle and cousins that I grew up with moved to Arizona and later to Arkansas. My own family, my mom, dad, brother, and sister moved to Arizona in search of work and eventually settled in South Carolina. They worked in the machine tool industry all of their lives. None of them had an education beyond high school, and they had nowhere to go, and they had limited options with the skills that they had in a shrinking industry. Their choices were limited. This not only created economic anxiety, but their social safety net was being torn apart too. My dad and his 7 brothers and sisters all lived within 30 minutes of each other. They used to watch each other's kids. They helped repair and build each other's homes. They spent holidays together. And anytime anyone was in need, they pitched in. They helped each other out. And now all that was gone. Many of those family-owned stores that I mentioned, well, they were also eventually closed as the town's economy slowed. The family-owned farms that I talked about, well, they changed too. You either became bigger and grew your farm, or you sold it to another family or another corporation. Now, there's nothing special about this story of my family or the town that I grew up in, but that's the problem. That's the problem. This is not the exception for many people in towns across America. It is the new normal in our country. And I am not suggesting that we should turn back the clock, because we can't. We can't turn back the clock. And besides, there are many people and places in America that have thrived in this automated global economy. We have seen innovations that have improved our lives and added conveniences in every aspect of what touches us. You know this well, from healthcare to communications. The global automated economy has changed in many ways, improved our lives. For those with a good education or the right kind of skills, or people who are in growing industries, frankly, things have never been better. But if you don't have the right kind of education or skills, or if you work in an industry all your life that is dying, times are pretty rough. And unfortunately, this is the story for a large segment of America. If you want to understand what's happening in American politics, which is the point I'm getting around to here, you need to understand what is happening to the people in the places like where I grew up. Here are some of the facts. In Ohio, since 1999, adjusted for 2014 dollars, the median household income has dropped by 16.1%. The county in the worst shape in Ohio is Williams County, where I grew up, which has seen the median household income drop by 26.7% since 1999. Those folks make more than 25% less in real dollars than they did in 1999. The story is not much better here in Cuyahoga County, which has seen a 20.6% decline. Whether you're from rural areas or urban areas, you're feeling the pinch. The people from these kinds of places have voted for politicians of both parties for the last 30 years. They've heard them talk about the economy, they've heard them talk about poverty, immigration reform, balanced budgets, the middle class, and how they're going to fix it. But they haven't fixed it, especially for them. For most Americans, they have seen healthcare costs go up, college tuitions go up even faster, they see big banks get bailed out, and they see their neighbors get foreclosed upon. They've seen a Washington, D.C. economy grow, and the people that go there get wealthy as they've fallen further and further behind, and they're absolutely fed up with it. After Governor Kasich and Ted Cruz dropped out of the presidential race recently, I called a friend of mine, Brian Davis, who is the Republican Party chairman in Williams County, and who also at one time worked at one of those companies that closed where I grew up. And I asked him, what will people do there? Who will they vote for? And Brian responded, Trump, definitely Trump. He elaborated by saying, as corny as it sounds, people here do business on a handshake. They feel like the establishment of both parties have lied to them. They just don't want people from the same old establishment anymore. And as I talked to Brian, I listened to this, I thought to myself, how does that handshake logic apply to Donald Trump? I said, the man often changes his positions in the same conversation. Logically to me, and probably for most of the people in this room based on your chuckles, this conclusion doesn't make sense. But anger and frustration sometimes are not logical. And these people know what Albert Einstein said about doing the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. It's not logical either. It's insanity. And that's the conclusion that many people in this country have come to. The reality is that many families throughout America are hurting because the opportunities that were once available to them are now gone. This is true in the neighborhoods of Cleveland and Akron as it is in small communities like Montpelier. So whether you relate to this story as best told through urban change, as might be depicted in a song that Bruce Springsteen wrote, My Hometown, or the plight described by John Mellencamp in his song, Rain on the Scarecrow, the consequences of rapid economic and social change and the failure of our political system to respond is resulting in the erosion of trust and perhaps the outright rejection of both political parties in this country. The people that live in these towns and neighborhoods have endured the pain of a changing economy and political dysfunction for long enough. They want change, and they are crying out and hoping someone will hear their plea. The good news is that a wake-up call has been sounded in our democracy, and political leaders are listening in a way I don't believe they have in a very long time. And I have evidence of this. I believe, that these voices proves that they are changing. Think about this. Republicans and Democrats are not ready to unify around their presumptive nominees just to win an election. It's not happening right now in both political parties. And further evidence is that Republicans and Democrats within their own parties are questioning long-held ideological views on crime, poverty, trade, military and foreign policy alliances, and our culture. Change is hard. Busting up old political alliances and making new ones is also hard. Admitting that times have changed and old ideas must go and new ideas must prevail is very hard. Slow and difficult as it is, I do believe that change is on its way. I don't believe this is going to be a simple process. I expect that it could take several election cycles for this to all shake out. In the meantime, this is where I believe the conversation will start. First, on our economy. Working class Americans need their leaders to be honest with them about what it will take for the American middle class to achieve victory in a global, automated economy. It's time for America to have the candid conversation and the tough talk about what it will take. Our politics. The next president will be viewed negatively by most voters, no matter who it is. The majority of people won't like them. In order for this meaningful change to happen, then, Democrats and Republicans will have to work together, and we will need a leader to ultimately prevail, now or in the future, who can unite us around a common vision that speaks to our hopes and aspirations and not to our biases and our fears. And the opposition party has to be a constructive partner in search of ways to agree. Our people, the American people. Change in America cannot be assigned solely to the presidency and to the Congress, but also to state leaders and media and business leaders and labor leaders and educators and faith leaders and moms and dads. Much of what it will take communities to become stronger and better can be done, though, without the federal government. And remember, real solutions involve sacrifice. Real solutions involve sacrifice. Don't expect leaders to do big things if you're not willing to sacrifice something. You can't compromise and find the middle ground unless all of us are willing to give up something for the good of our nation. So let me ask again, what in the world is happening to our American democracy? Can we still believe in it? The answer is absolutely yes, we can. We can believe in it, for as we speak, change is fueling our political system, because in 2016, American democracy is sending a message, and it's getting our collective attentions. Never forget that our democracy and society has faced deeper divisions. From the Civil War to Vietnam, our nation has always responded to the challenges we've faced. Every generation faces a new set of challenges, and these are ours. Sometimes that change does not come from the top down, but rather from the bottom up. And that's why democracy is such a great thing. Thank you very much.
I hope everybody's enjoying the forum today, featuring Secretary of State Jon Husted. Very nice remarks, very inspirational. We thank you. We are about to begin the audience Q&A. We welcome questions from everyone, City Club members, guests, students, or those of us just joining us via our webcast. If you would like to tweet out a question, please tweet it at the City Club, one word, and staff will try to work it into the program. We want to remind you, your questions should be brief and to the point. Holding the microphone today is the Director of Programming, Stephanie Jansky, and Content Associate, Teddy Eisenberg. So can we have the first question, please?
Mr. Secretary, as we heard earlier from these fine students, they will be going on to careers in higher education. What would you say from your perspective to the high school student like your dad that graduates in a month or so and doesn't have the opportunity to go on to higher education? What words of encouragement or hope would you have here in the state of Ohio for those students to be able to earn a career and provide for their families without the benefit of higher education?
Okay. Well, it's a great question, and a couple things. First off, they have to believe. They have to believe that there is hope for their future. They have to find what that purpose is for them, and they have to, and hopefully, they have somebody in their lives that they can lean on, and they should find them, and they should find somebody to lean on to help give them some path and some direction for the future. They should know that America is the greatest country in the world still. People aren't trying to leave, they're still trying to come. And for many, it's still the best time ever. For example, as much as we struggle, and what I said in my remarks, I really believe that there is a huge segment of our population that's struggling more than they ever have, and the pathway is very difficult for them. I also look at little girls like my daughters who are 9 and 6. And I would argue, if you're a little girl, that United States of America today is the best place in the world, in the history of the world, to grow up as a little girl, because you can do the same things as little boys. The world is unlimited, and throughout human history that's not been true. So there's still plenty of reasons to be optimistic and hopeful. But I would tell them that in this economy that we have, that you have to have a skill, that you have to have some kind of skill. Whether it's a technical skill, it's an education, things are more specialized, so you have to hone and specialize your skill. Don't think you have to have it figured out today, though. There's time, but you have to want to do it. You have to find a pathway to do that. But I will tell you this, as much as we talk about all of those needs for STEM skills and all these things, if you're willing to work hard, you're willing to play by the rules, and you're just, and you're determined, there's a way. I don't mean it's going to be an easy way, but there is hope out there for everybody, and you have a lot of resources here in your community and communities across the state that those kids can tap into to find educational opportunities. Use the guidance counselor. Call my office. My goodness, if you're a young person that's looking for a way in life, you call me. I'll help you. I'll help you navigate this. I'll get you in touch with people that will help.
I think everybody in this room would probably agree with your call for a change in our politics and for opposition parties, for instance, to be a more constructive force in political discourse than they've proven to be in the past. But there are certain structural problems that get in the way of that happening, one of which is gerrymandered congressional districts. In the past, you've been an advocate for redistricting reform, and Ohio took a half step last year with the legislative districts in Ohio. But are you still an advocate for congressional redistricting reform? And what do you see happening on that front? Is there a possibility of that occurring in the near future?
Absolutely, I'm an advocate for congressional redistricting reform not only in Ohio, but across the country. And for those who may not be super familiar with the topic, for the past, couple generations of politics, essentially we have been gerrymandering. Well, we've been doing it our whole lives, but it's become worse. It's been the history of America we've been doing, but it's become worse recently with technology and the way that people can really carve up districts, and the fact that we have self-segregated ourselves in societies, in very red communities and very blue communities, and so the problem has become worse over the past couple of decades. Because what happens is with our gerrymandering, we essentially, whoever wins the primary in our legislative process in every state, whether it's in the legislature or in Congress, whoever wins the primary wins the general election. And how do you win a primary? You run to the far left if you're a Democrat, you run to the far right as you're a Republican, and then your constituency essentially is the primary voter, not the general election voter. And because of that, you have to continue to appeal to the political left or the political right, and there's no way for you. Listen, the people that are your constituency really that decided you're elected, they don't want you to go compromise. They want you to stand firm to this thing over here. But we have to change the incentives, and redistricting reform changes the incentives to speak to the general election audience, because if we create compact, competitive districts, then the voice of the average voter will become more powerful, and the people that I was talking about in my remarks, they're going to have a bit greater voice in the process. And redistricting reform must happen. It must not only happen in Ohio, it must happen across the country. Ohioans made a great step last fall with the work that they did in passing a constitutional amendment to change legislative redistricting. It's going to happen in Ohio. The legislature and our congressional delegation, I hope, will lead it, because if they don't lead it, then it will be given to them in a way that they might not appreciate through a ballot initiative. And it's always better to be part of the change than a victim of it, and I hope that they will see it that way.
Mr. Secretary, thank you for the great job you're doing and for your great interesting remarks. After every election, we bemoan the fact that a great percentage of the voters don't vote, and then they're complaining what goes on. There's some countries, the one comes to mind is Australia, where if you don't vote, you pay a fine. As our chief election officer, what is your feeling? What are the pros and the cons if we had, as a nation, the same system where if you don't vote, you still pay a fine? Obviously encouraging, therefore, more people to vote. And just as a sidebar, do you care to predict what's going to come out of the Trump-Ryan meeting this afternoon and whether he'll continue to run the convention?
I can answer both of those. Let me try to get at the first one, the question surrounding the idea of mandatory voting and things like that. I believe in America you have the freedom to vote. You also have the freedom not to vote. That's part of exercising democracy. How many people have you heard already say, well, I'm not going to vote in the presidential election? They'll vote, but people get frustrated. I know this. Those aunts and uncles I talked about, some of them don't vote. You want to know why they don't vote? Because they don't think it matters. They don't think if they vote for a Democrat or Republican that makes any difference, because they think they're all the same. And that's why we have lower participation, because there are a lot of people out there that don't think it makes any difference who they vote for. Because all they do is they see them as people who go there and they fight and they never do anything and their lives don't get any better and they got better things to do with their time. And I know them. They're part of my family. You'd think as Secretary of State I might be able to persuade them, but apparently not. And so, I don't think we should have anything mandatory. I think that redistricting reform helps, because the more when you create a system that makes political leaders more responsive, that means elections will matter more, and that means the voters will engage more. So I think the reforms to our democracy and to making our system better will help generate more voter participation. I think that's important. As far as Paul Ryan and Donald Trump go, I think it's very good that Paul Ryan said, hey, wait a minute. Let's don't paper over our differences. There's some big differences here. We don't have to go do this immediately. Let's talk about it. Let's see if these things that we stand for are the same things that you stand for. And if we can bridge that gap with some meaningful policies and ideas that are going to respond to this frustration that we're hearing from the American voters. And so I think it's great that this conversation is happening, and people in my political party are not just saying, sure, go ahead and support the nominee. Let's figure it out. Let's have that conversation, and I believe that Paul Ryan and Donald Trump will be better for having been forced to have that conversation, and I'm glad that it happened.
Following on to the question about redistricting, is the state of Ohio giving any consideration to changing the way we vote, like a ranked choice voting kind of model, which opens up voting to more than just the two parties in some cases and gives a little more equity?
It's been a conversation that I have heard, that I have heard people have, but not in the legislative process or any serious conversations about changing how we vote in terms of things like single ballot primaries, where everybody who wants to run is on the same primary ballot. The two that get the most votes will appear on the ballot in November. I think that there is some merit to that conversation. If you look at what happened in the presidential election, just think about how the states turned out differently when you had different sets of rules. You had one set of rules with caucuses, which favored one type of candidate. You had another set of rules for closed primaries. You had another that advantaged some candidates. And then you had another set of rules where you had more open primaries where independent voters could be involved. That changed the dynamics of literally who won those states or didn't win those states. And so the rules of how you operate elections in your democracy as it relates to those standards can generate different results. And so we're at the City Club, we should have those conversations. This is what it's about, right, Dan? Yeah. Exactly. It's about having conversations about new ideas. And I think that those ideas will catch more energy if our political system continues to be as dysfunctional as it is. So the more dysfunctional it is, the more people will look to changing the system rather than just the actors in the system.
We've talked about the importance of voting. Can you please talk a little bit more about the options that people have for voting in Ohio?
Sure. Well, I've always pursued the goal of trying to make it easy to vote and hard to cheat, meaning that we want everybody to vote and we want to make sure the elections have integrity. And in Ohio this fall, we will have 28 days of early voting. Shortly after Labor Day, I will send every registered voter in the state an absentee ballot request. And if you fill that out and turn it in 28 days before the election, Pat McDonald will send you an absentee ballot in the mail, and you can vote from home. You can mail it in or drop that off at the Board of Elections. And then we will have voting during the weekdays and on weekends during that 28-day period. We'll have 2 weekends of voting, Saturdays and Sundays, and then 13 hours on Election Day at over 9,000 precinct locations across the state of Ohio. So we provide a great menu of options, and Ohioans have no excuse for not participating.
Thank you. I agree that it's very important for a lot of people to be able to go out and vote. And as someone who was temporarily disenfranchised by your decisions regarding the 17-year-old's right to vote, I was wondering if your position on this issue has changed in light of Judge Frye's ruling. Thank you.
Well, the issue is that in Ohio, the Ohio Constitution says you must be 18 years old to be an elector. And Democrats and Republicans have always interpreted the Constitution and the law that way with respect to presidential elections, okay? So we've since the time I was been Secretary of State, and the way my predecessors did it, 17-year-olds could vote, but they could only vote on nominating elections or nominating contests, meaning like U.S. Senate or Congress or county commissioner or something like that. But you couldn't vote on a ballot issue, for example, your school levy or something like that, because you have to be 18 to be an elector, and that would be making a final decision about something, whereas with the other races, you're only nominating somebody to do it. In the case of the presidential election, which people from Cleveland should be painfully aware of, that we are not electing or we are not nominating a candidate, we are electing delegates. So the delegates are elected. We don't actually nominate somebody, you are electing somebody. And because that's the way the Constitution reads, that's the way we have always enforced it in the state of Ohio. And if anybody wants to change the rules, that's great. I just don't think judges should do this 4 days before an election.
Good afternoon. So if the primary is an indication of turnout, what changes are going to be required so that we have timely and accurate results so I don't have to stay up till 3 o'clock in the morning?
Well, I called Rob Frost and Pat McDonald about that in Cuyahoga County, and they're going to be all over it. So I'm confident that they're going to make sure that everything comes in smoothly and in a timely manner. We have made great progress on that in the state of Ohio. I was happy this spring that our results that we were posting on our website at the Secretary of State's office were actually faster than the national media's results. And so the technology that we have continues to get to improve all the time, those results. What I'm more worried about is the voters' experience, first of all, on the front end, that we do our best to make sure that everybody has convenient opportunity to vote, that there aren't long lines. That's why you'll see me that's why we send these absentee ballot requests out. You will see me being very vocal about vote early, vote those absentee ballots, get the ballots voted, because last presidential election, we had 33% of all of the voters cast the ballot early. And where that's helpful for us as election administrators is that that's 33% fewer people that we deal with on election day, which means that's fewer people at the polls, which means shorter lines and better experiences for everybody. So the more we can spread that early vote out across those 28 days, I think the more convenient it will be for everybody. But on election night, I'm more interested in accuracy than speed. Because what I don't want any Board of Elections to do is to do something wrong, come up with the wrong tally, and then have to go back and correct it, because that undermines voter confidence. So I would rather any of us, including me, have to stay up a little later to make sure that we're absolutely right, rather than going fast and getting it wrong and then having to correct it after the fact. But I believe that we continue to make this process more efficient, that results will come in faster and faster all the time. But look, if there's a really close race, we're going to make sure that we get it right. We're not going to worry about speed and make sure we get it right.
Good afternoon. Secretary Husted, I found it ironic that you talked so much about democracy, because so many of the restrictive voting laws that you and the Republican Party have put into place, I think, are really the opposite of democracy. And one of the things that I think is really a problem was last year, there were 40,000 names purged from the voter rolls for whatever reason, and a lawsuit has been filed by the ACLU saying that that purging violated the National Voter Registration Act. My concern is that because low-income people move so much and so forth, that purging will probably target a particular group of people. So my question is, how, if you're going to purge that, and I'm not saying that you personally were, that was your idea, but the fact that it happened, I think, is horrible. So how can people who were purged know that they were purged so that they don't go to the polls, as has happened in the past, and suddenly they find out they've been thrown off the voter rolls? So I need you to defend the purging and help me understand why it's even necessary.
I'm happy to field that question. Thank you. First of all, the voting rules, you mentioned Republicans. It was Republicans, while I was Speaker of the House, that actually enacted early voting. So we created the whole early voting system in the state of Ohio. And I have defended that and supported that. But just because you create something doesn't mean that you can't continue to amend it and make it better and make it more a thoughtful process. And I believe that the process that we have today is a very good one, and that nobody can have a legitimate reason for not casting a ballot in the state of Ohio because we've made it so easy. Now, on the voter rolls, we have an obligation under federal and state law. And I would remind you, I implement these laws. I don't make them. I used to make them, now I implement them, the new ones that get changed. On the way that we've handled voter roll maintenance, you use the term purging, we're following the voter roll maintenance procedures that have been in place essentially since Bob Taft was Secretary of State, through Ken Blackwell, through Jennifer Bruner, and to this very day, in my role as Secretary of State, we follow the same set of rules. And this is essentially what our process is. Okay? If you vote, right, you're registered. You voted, let's say you voted in 2008, but you didn't vote in 2009 or 2010. Okay, we send you a card in the mail to say, do you still live there? Do you still want to be registered to vote at this address? If you send the card back, nothing happens. If you don't send it back, then we put you in, we flag your registration and put it into that process where we look at voter roll maintenance. Then, if you didn't vote in 2008, 2009, and not 2010, 2011, 2012, 2013, and 14, okay? If you didn't vote, then we remove your name for the rolls because that's what the law says that we're supposed to do. So you've had to have been 6 years without voting before you would get your name removed from the rolls, okay? So that's the process. That's what the law says. That's what we follow. Some people might not like that, but this is why it's necessary. A, it's the law, and B, we've had many counties in Ohio that have ended up having more voters on the voter rolls than they actually have adults living in the county, okay? So when you have 106% voter registration in a county, that's a problem. It undermines voter confidence. It leads to problems, potential voter fraud, longer lines at the polls because you're going through a bunch of people's names that aren't there anymore. When we send the absentee ballot applications out, we don't want to be sending applications out to people who are no longer there because that has the potential to impact the integrity of the system. So that's the process. The reason we do it that way is because that's what the law says. And I believe that anybody who's truly engaged in democracy and wants to be involved probably has voted in that 6-year period. But most of the people we end up removing are people who've moved, who've died, who just don't want to be part, or have moved on and are maybe into a different state or in a different county. So that's how that process works. It's what we've always followed, and I believe it works very well. And if we don't like it, then somebody should introduce a bill and debate it and change it. But we shouldn't constantly be running to the courts every time we don't like a piece of public policy and expect a judge to change something that should have been changed through the democratic process.
Secretary Husted, we have a question from Twitter. At Forward Falcon would like to know why more progress hasn't been made to enact online voter registration.
Well, we have been at this since 2011 when I got to office. We have an online voter registration bill that has passed the Ohio Senate. It just was voted out of committee in the Ohio House. We fully expect it will be on the floor in the next couple of weeks, and that online voter registration will come to Ohio. I love the bill in every way but one, in that it will delay enactment until the 2017 calendar year. I would rather it be enacted now, because online voter registration does 3 things. It's obviously more convenient for voters. It saves money, because you no longer have to key in all of this information at the local level. You can upload it electronically. And 3, it's more secure, because we can instantaneously check people's requests with the BMV to make sure that they are eligible to vote in Ohio. And so in every way, it passed my test of making it easy to vote and hard to cheat. And I wish that the legislature had passed it years ago. I'm glad they're going to pass it now. And so at Forward Falcon can be relieved that it's on its way.
Secretary, thank you for coming back to the City Club. We always enjoy having you. Those statistics about the declining income are very concerning over the last 16 and 17 years. I am very concerned with the marijuana legislation advancing again, that this is going to continue to have a detrimental impact on our income. Now they're using the term medical marijuana. When I took my kids to California a couple of years ago, we were stopped on the beach 2 or 3 times with people saying, "Come on up to our shop, we can give you a prescription for medical marijuana." When I was a student at Ohio State, I sat in my 22-year-old cousin's hospital room while he whipped out a pipe and lit up to manage the nausea from his cancer. If we legalize medical marijuana, our employers are having a hard enough time finding people that can pass a drug test now. What is going to happen to all these kids that start smoking and can't get jobs to our economy?
The issue of marijuana in Ohio obviously was brought to a height last November with the ballot initiative that would have legalized 10 sites, essentially created a monopoly for the commercial production and sale of medical marijuana, or for marijuana for recreational and medicinal purposes. The voters rejected that 65-35. As the chair of the ballot board, who oversees ballot initiatives, I can tell you that there are 7 pending marijuana proposals on the continuum of having great latitude for use to more restrictive latitude for use. And so the question that we're pursuing in Ohio right now is that, do we want to enact a reasonable medical marijuana standard to avoid somebody from using the ballot process to use medical marijuana to enact full-blown or backdoor recreational marijuana processes that could happen. So the General Assembly has been, I believe, thoughtfully and I don't say that about a lot of things, but I think this process has been very thoughtful, okay? That they've done a good job of having a conversation with law enforcement and medical professionals and people who have afflictions that would benefit from the use of medical marijuana. They passed a bill out of the House recently that would limit it to 20 different types of ailments that would be under the strict reporting procedures for doctors that would, I think, be a reasonable standard for introducing medical marijuana into Ohio without creating a full-blown circumstance like California has, and then making it proliferate to the point where a lot of young people and people who maybe have propensities for addiction are involved in the use of marijuana, because the number one reason, as you mentioned, that an employer can't hire a young person or an entry-level person is because that person can't pass a drug test. So we have all of those competing factors at work. What's the reasonable standard? Should it be done through the General Assembly rather than a ballot initiative? I think so. And I hope collectively in Ohio that we will have that thoughtful debate will go on, and that we can find a reasonable standard for medical marijuana without blowing open the opportunity for full-blown recreational marijuana. And I think it's going to happen.
Secretary Husted, has the New York Times ever apologized to you or acknowledged their editorials where they lashed into you for the question of whether we have, 28 days or 33 days, whatever it is, of early voting, without ever acknowledging, and they do this in their editorial page, whereas in the state of New York, there's no early voting. And has that ever come up? I marveled at it as I read it, and I just wondered about it.
An interesting thing happened on that front. I offered to go see them. They didn't want to visit with me. I wrote them a letter where I pointed out that Ohio has a month of early voting and they have 1 day, and they edited that line out of my piece, free speech not given. Interesting, huh? And I'm happy to have those conversations, but unfortunately, those conversations distract from the real issues, because it's easy to vote in our state. And we should stop the hysteria on both political sides, and I will on voter fraud and voter disenfranchisement, okay? It's easy to vote in America, it's easy to vote in Ohio. The political extremes are trying to exploit those conversations. That's why I try to talk about these things and how we're trying to solve those problems, bridge those gaps, because more importantly, is those people I were telling you about. That's what we have to talk about. We have to talk about the economy. We have to talk about what's going on in people's lives, the social change, and what's happening to families. The American family today is as broken as it's ever been. Children are suffering. Our economy is, leaving a lot of people behind. Those are the conversations that should be going on during the political process, not the nonsense around the process. So, but no apology yet received. So.
One more question for you, sir. I think this is the final question. And I know you just said you want to talk about the economy, but I'm going to ask you again about voting. And really about the conversations you have with your colleagues in the other 49 states who are ensuring a quality elections process. You have worked hard to bring online voter registration, and that's certainly exciting and a big innovation for the nation, frankly. What about online voting?
Online voting. Well, I'm sure the next Secretary of State will have something to say about that, but not this one, right? Online voting. Well, I'm trying to get online voter registration done, so that's the first box we'll check. Online voting, I think, is a ways off for two reasons. First off, people don't trust it. One of the things that you want to have from your election system is confidence. You want people to believe in it. You want people to trust it. If you had an online system, the conspiracy theories would be launched immediately, and people would lose confidence in it. And that's more of a generational thing. So at time, I think that those concerns will fade, but we'll see. The other side of it is it's very expensive to design a system for 2 days, essentially the primary and the general election. and then without getting rid of the other things. Because understand, if we do online voting, people are still going to want their precinct location, they're still going to want early voting, they're still going to want by mail, and you're just adding more and more cost to the system to solve a problem that I'm not sure exists. And I believe that for those reasons. I mean, like banks, they have, you do everything on your bank because they're 24 hours a day, it's 7 days a week, 365 days a year. We're talking about designing an entire secure, extremely secure system for 2 days. And I just think that we're a ways from doing those kinds of things. Mostly, though, because of the first reason, not the second. Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed today's forum featuring Ohio Secretary of State Jon Husted. Today's forum is the Peter DeLeon Endowment Forum on Local Politics, made possible by a generous gift from Mr. DeLeon. It is also part of our Politics and Policy series sponsored by Cleveland.com. We thank both of you for your support. Special thanks to our table sponsors, the Cuyahoga County Board of Elections, Forest City Medical Mutual, the Office of Secretary of State, the Republican Party of Cuyahoga County, Retzel and Andrus, and the University Hospital. Student participation from Cleveland Heights University and the Hawk Inn School was made possible by the Jeffrey David Epstein Memorial Fund. We thank you for your support. And this brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Secretary Husted. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club Forums on IdeaStream is made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskind Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.